Good morning. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the third guest speaker of the semester, Hao Dong, who will discuss with you Harry Frankfurt's seminal paper, Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person. Hao is a third-year PhD student in philosophy here at Princeton, having previously gotten his MA at Peking University, the top university in China. His area of specialization is early modern philosophy, that is, the philosophy of the 17th and 18th centuries, roughly speaking. Hao has written and already published on the intersection between philosophy and science in that era. He also has a forthcoming paper on Hobbes and Descartes' optics, and is currently working on Leibniz and Hobbes' natural philosophy. This interest in the early modern period also makes Hao an ideal lecturer for today's topic, because it was in the early modern period that people first began to grapple seriously with many of the philosophical challenges that arise from a scientific view of the world as governed by mechanistic laws of nature, problems that, as we saw in our last lecture, are still very much with us today. Many of the philosophers that Hao studies, Hobbes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, for instance, grappled with the question how to situate human liberty in a world governed by such mechanistic laws of nature. And they were among the first to articulate recognizable versions of the doctrine that today we know as compatibilism, and which in its modern incarnation will be the subject of Hao's lecture today. Hao also tells me that he has a special connection to today's author, Harry Frankfurt. Frankfurt's book on Descartes, Demons, Dreamers, and Madmen, was one of the first books of philosophy that Hao read in English, so he has a special affinity for Frankfurt's writing. Hao, the floor is yours.
Today we'll be discussing Harry Frankfurt's 1971 paper, Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person. Harry Frankfurt is a prominent philosopher who spent the last decade or so of his career here in Princeton before retiring in 2002. He has done seminal work in many areas, but has been most known to the general public for his philosophical discussion of bullshit, which drew him to The Daily Show, a rare achievement for a philosopher indeed. I came to know Frankfurt's writings when I started studying Descartes' Meditations when I was an undergrad. His Demons, Dreams, and Madmen is basically listed in every syllabus of courses dealing with early modern rationalism. So today, I'm really excited to talk to you about another major work of his, namely his defense of compatibilism. Now, what is compatibilism? In our last lecture, we have seen that, according to the modern scientific picture of the world, for every event, including our own actions and mental states, there must be a previous event that causes it to happen. And the fact that we are inextricably embedded in this chain of causes seems, to many philosophers, to be incompatible with our status as free and morally responsible agents. So this seems to leave two possibilities. Either we deny our free agency and embrace the view that we are no more free and morally responsible than stones, or we bluntly insist that humans are exempt from causal laws, and hence they constitute an independent kingdom within the kingdom of nature. The former position is usually called hard determinism, the latter libertarianism, the view defended by Richard Taylor, the author we read for our last lecture. It is noteworthy that one of the most famous contemporary libertarians, Roderick Chisholm, was Richard Taylor's doctoral advisor, and Chisholm's view of a person is faithfully recaptured in that last section of Taylor's chapter. Chisholm perhaps embodies the libertarianism in its strongest form, who has denied that there could ever be a science of man, because he thinks that at least some of human actions are exempt from causal laws. Notice that although the hard determinist and the libertarian reach diametrically opposite conclusions on the question whether we are free and morally responsible, they do share one crucial assumption in common, namely, if the thesis of metaphysical determinism is true, then we cannot be free and morally responsible for our actions. This claim which both hard determinists and libertarians accept, is known as incompatibilism. Namely, determinism and moral responsibility are incompatible. However, not all philosophers accept that these are, in fact, our only two options. They believe there is a third alternative, which begins by rejecting the assumption that the hard determinist and the libertarian held in common. The so-called compatibilists, or soft determinists, as Taylor calls them, hold that freedom and moral responsibility are, in fact, compatible with metaphysical determinism. However, early versions of compatibilism often seem artificial and rigged because at the basis of incompatibilism lies an assumption that is of great intuitive appeal. That is, we are free and morally responsible for what we have done only if we could have done otherwise. In a previous paper of his, published in 1969, titled Alternate Possibilities and Moral Responsibility, Frankfurt has named this assumption the principle of alternate possibilities, or PAP. If PAP is true, then since compatibilists are also committed to determinism, they will be forced to come up with some unnatural interpretation of what could have done otherwise means, in order to make it compatible with determinism, which often turns out to diminish the appeal of their stance. In the 1969 paper, Frankfurt has come up with a strong argument against PAP by asking us to consider the following scenario, which we have considered at the end of our last lecture. Suppose someone, Black, let us say, wants Jones to perform a certain action. Black is prepared to go to considerable lengths to get his way, but he prefers to avoid showing his hand unnecessarily. So he waits until Jones is about to make up his mind what to do, and he does nothing unless it is clear to him, Black is an excellent judge of such things, that Jones is going to decide to do something other than what he wants him to do. If it does become clear that Jones is going to decide to do something else, Black takes effective steps to ensure that Jones decides to do and that he does do what he wants him to do. Whatever Jones's initial preferences and inclinations, then, Black will have his way. Let us think about the case in a more concrete way, perhaps. Suppose I'm a preceptor who is just about to grade your first assignment, and you, a brilliant biochemistry student who is not so confident about your philosophical skills, decide to put some magic drug in my coffee. The effect of the drug is that if your paper was not so good and I were going to grade your paper lower than A, then I would be unwittingly led to change my mind and give your paper an A. But if your paper was actually excellent and I were going to give your paper an A in any case, then the drug would not have any effect on me. Frankfurt's point is that even if the only possible outcome is that I would give you an A and I could not have done otherwise, in the case where the drug has no effect, I am still responsible for giving you an A. However, in the case of the preceptor and the biochemistry student, it now seems somehow dubious that even in the case where the drug is ineffective, the preceptor should retain full responsibility for giving the student an A. Perhaps the student should at least be partly responsible for the outcome, because the drug, in a sense, secures the outcome by adding something extra to the force of the will of the preceptor, although both the drug and the will of the preceptor are sufficient for bringing about the outcome. Here we have a case of overdetermination. And now I would like to take a few moments to consider whether overdetermination could diminish responsibility, and if it could, does this issue pose any serious threat to Frankfurt's main point? Now let us ignore this complicated issue and assume that Frankfurt's argument against PAP is a complete success. However, there are still problems with this preliminary defense on compatibilism. The first problem is that under this proposal, creatures to which we usually do not want to ascribe freedom and moral responsibility, such as animals or irrational human beings, may turn out to be free and morally responsible agents as long as they have the capacity to want to do something, which is not something very rare. In other words, drones could well be a dog or an infant. The second problem is that it is no longer obvious why it is good and desirable to be a free agent. Because in the drone's case, Jones's desire to do something, even when he has been manipulated by Black, always gets fulfilled. And there does not seem to be any difference between the case where Jones is a free agent and the case where he is not. So we need a theory of personhood that identifies the distinguishing feature of a person and explains why being a person can be desirable. Before we proceed to see Frankfurt's solution presented in his 1971 paper, perhaps we could already see where the problem lies. In the Jones case, what is at issue is only the freedom of action, that is, the conformity between Jones's action and his desire. As long as Jones's actual desire is fulfilled, Jones acts freely and is thus morally responsible for what he does. However, persons often reflect on their desires. They want to have some of them, but want to refrain from others. Philosophers are aware of this from the early on. In the dialogue Phaedrus, Plato has compared the human soul to a chariot led by two horses, one white, one black. The charioteer represents the intellect or reason, where our ultimate identity lies, while the white horse represents the spirited part of a soul that has more noble desires, and the black horse represents more base part of our soul that is full of sensual desires. The charioteer oversees the two horses and has to control and suppress the black horse with the help of the white horse. Here we can see the idea that we align ourselves with some of our desires and alienate ourselves from others. This idea has been widespread throughout history, especially among the religious thinkers, and Frankfurt's proposal seems to be under the influence of this long and well-entrenched tradition. Now let us get to Frankfurt's proposal itself. In a nutshell, the concept of person that Frankfurt offers is that a person is a creature that has second-order volitions. As we can see from this formulation, being a human being or a member of Homo sapiens is neither necessary nor sufficient for being a person. When it comes to the question of whether a creature is a person or not, all that matters is whether it has this thing called second-order volitions. So what are second-order volitions? Second-order volitions are a special kind of second-order desires. What are second-order desires then? It is easy to understand that we, or some other animal, have desires. Most often, these desires are first-order desires. That is, they directly point towards some action by which the desire are fulfilled. For example, when I have a desire to eat a cheeseburger, this desire is a first-order desire, which is satisfied by my action of reaching out my hands and actually eating this cheeseburger. Also, it's very common that we could have conflicts among our first-order desires. So that if I realize that cheeseburgers are bad for my health, I could form another first-order desire to refrain from eating the cheeseburger. Since I cannot satisfy both my desires to eat and to refrain from eating the cheeseburger, one of them will be bound to be unsatisfied. If I say to myself, screw it, and reach for the cheeseburger anyways, then my desire to eat the burger will be my effective desire that actually motivates my action. Frankfurt names the effective first-order desire the will. The ineffective desire that fails to motivate my action will not become my will. Now, a second-order desire is not the desire to do some action, but rather a desire to have a certain first-order desire. By this definition, a second-order desire is satisfied only by our having a certain first-order desire, regardless of whether this first-order desire is our motivating will. Frankfurt provides us with a vivid example to illustrate this. Suppose that a physician engaged in psychotherapy with narcotics addicts believes that his ability to help his patients would be enhanced if he understood better what it is like for them to desire the drug to which they are addicted. Suppose that he is led in this way to want to have a desire for the drug. What the physician wants, insofar as he wants to have a desire, is to be inclined to, or moved to some extent to take the drug. It is entirely possible, however, that although he wants to be moved by a desire to take the drug, he does not want the desire to be effective. He may not want it to move him all the way to action. However, although this example shows that there are this kind of mere second-order desires, which are satisfied merely by our having certain first-order desires, but not by any actual actions, Frankfurt thinks that these second-order desires stand at the margin of preciosity. He thinks that most of the time, our second-order desires not only call for our having certain first-order desires, but also that these first-order desires should be effective and motivate an action. To return to the example of me and the cheeseburger, suppose that I have a second-order desire to want to refrain from eating the burger. This second-order desire does not seem to be completely satisfied merely by my having the first-order desire to refrain from eating the burger. Rather, it is satisfied only when my desire to refrain from eating the burger becomes my effective desire or will. In this case, my second-order desire to want to refrain from eating the burger is a second-order volition. So a second-order volition is satisfied only by having certain will. In Frankfurt's own words, someone has a desire of the second order either when he wants simply to have a certain desire or when he wants a certain desire to be his will. In the situations of the latter kind, I shall call his second-order desires second-order volitions, or volitions of the second order. Second-order volitions are essential to a person because Frankfurt thinks that it is only when we have second-order volitions that we could identify ourselves with some of our first-order desires. Otherwise, we will be mere bystanders to our conflicting first-order desires and do not have any stake in how the conflict plays out. Frankfurt memorably calls the latter wantons. Now it is important to note that by wanton, Frankfurt does not mean the Asian dumpling, but rather those creatures without second-order volitions, like animals and very young children. To illustrate the difference between a person and a wanton, Frankfurt uses the example of an unwilling addict and a wanton addict. Both addicts are addicted to some drug, and they inevitably end up taking the drug, and in doing so, making their first-order desire to take the drug their will. Yet, the unwilling addict who has a second-order volition to refrain from taking the drug is not neutral with regard to the conflict between his desire to take the drug and his desire to refrain from taking it. It is the latter desire, and not the former, that he wants to constitute his will. It is the latter desire rather than former that he wants to be effective and to provide the purpose that he will seek to realize in what he actually does. By contrast, the wanton addict's actions reflect the economy of his first-order desire, without his being concerned whether the desires that move him to act are desires by which he wants to be moved to act. That is to say, only persons, in virtue of their second-order volitions, could identify themselves with some of their conflicting first-order desires. And, as a consequence, only persons could meaningfully say that they are not themselves when their effective first-order desire is not in accord with their second-order volition. Now perhaps it is time to take a pause and do a little bit of self-reflection on whether, by Frankfurt standard, you are being a person or a wanton while you are watching this video. And if the former, what is your second-order volition? And what are your conflicting first-order desires? With the concept of a person having been clarified, Frankfurt proceeds to clarify the problem of freedom of the will and moral responsibility. Frankfurt thinks that freedom of the will consists in the conformity of the will to the second-order volitions, Thus, only persons could enjoy freedom of the will. Animals and wantons who do not have second-order volitions may only have freedom of action, which only consists in the conformity of their action to their first-order desire. Also, it is important to note that such conformity must be deliberate and not accidental. To use Frankfurt's own words, it is in securing the conformity of his will to his second-order volitions, then, that a person exercises freedom of the will. And it is in the discrepancy between his will and his second-order volitions, or in his awareness that their coincidence is not his own doing, but only a happy chance, that a person who does not have this freedom feels its lack. Thus, suppose that I have a second-order volition to refrain from eating the burger, a conflicting first-order desire to eat and to refrain from eating the burger. Suppose further that while I am deliberating about what to do, a gust of wind comes and blows my burger into the trash bin. Unfortunately, I can no longer eat my burger. Thus, my first-order desire to refrain from eating the burger automatically prevails and becomes my will. In this case, there is still conformity between my second-order volition and my will, but this conformity is only accidental, and I might not feel that I am exercising freedom of the will when this happens. By contrast, it is only when I make up my mind and resolutely refrain from eating the burger that I exercise freedom of the will. Now there arises another problem that might present some challenge to Frankfurt's position. Could we ascribe freedom to second-order volitions as well? If we could, then according to Frankfurt's position, freedom of a second-order volition would consist in the conformity of this second-order volition to some third-order volition, ad infinitum. Frankfurt replies to this challenge by insisting that freedom of the will only concerns first-order desires. Thus, our second-order volitions constitute the starting point of the question of freedom of the will. Frankfurt puts it this way. When a person identifies himself decisively with one of his first-order desires, this commitment resounds throughout the potentially endless array of higher orders. Consider a person who, without reservation or conflict, wants to be motivated by the desire to concentrate on his work. The fact that his second-order volition to be moved by this desire is a decisive one means that there's no room for question concerning the pertinence of desires or volitions of higher orders. Is this reply satisfactory? We will see that the problem still presents some difficulty with regard to the issue of moral responsibility, which we will discuss now. Building on his account of freedom of the will, Frankfurt thinks that we are morally responsible for what we have done only when we have acted of our free will. That is, only when our will is in conformity with our second-order volitions, and when our action is also in conformity with our will. Freedom of the will adds an extra layer to Frankfurt's previous account in the Jones case. In the Jones case, it is at least not clear that if Jones were like the unwilling addict who did not want his current will to be his will, then Jones would be relieved of his moral responsibility. Now we can see that since the unwilling addict has not acted of his own free will, therefore he was in a sense coerced to do what he has done, which alleviates his responsibility. In contrast to the unwilling addict, Frankfurt invites us to consider the case of a willing addict. Suppose that his addiction has the same physiological basis and the same irresistible thrust as the addictions of the unwilling and wanton addicts, but that he is altogether delighted with his condition. He is a willing addict, who would not have things any other way. If the grip of his addiction should somehow weaken, he would do whatever he could do to reinstate it. If his desire for the drug should begin to fade, he would take steps to renew its intensity. The willing addict, due to his addiction, could not have willed otherwise. yet his will is still in perfect, deliberate, non-accidental conformity with his second-order volition. Frankfurt thinks that, in this case, the agent should be held morally responsible for what he has done, even if he could not have done and willed otherwise. This constitutes a revision to the Jones case. In order that Jones be held morally responsible, it is not sufficient that he only has freedom of action, as in the original case, but rather he should also have freedom of the will. Also, since one could have freedom of the will even when one could not have willed otherwise, the agent's will is not free in the sense of being undetermined or spontaneous like the libertarian will, but rather free in the sense of having a perfect accord with his second-order volition. I think this is a contrast that Frankfurt wants to bring out by the following puzzling statement. This assumption, i.e., the assumption that the person is morally responsible for what he has done, does entail that the person did what he did freely, or that he did it of his own free will. It is a mistake, however, to believe that someone acts freely only when he is free to do whatever he wants, or that he acts of his own free will only if his will is free. What does this statement mean? My interpretation of this statement is that here Frankfurt is distinguishing between two kinds of freedom of the will. The will of the willing addict is not free in the libertarian sense, because he could not have willed otherwise. However, Frankfurt thinks that the agent still has freedom of the will or acts of his own free will because there's a deliberate, non-accidental conformity between his second-order volition and will, which makes him morally responsible for what he has done. And since this latter kind of freedom of the will is not the same as the freedom to have willed otherwise, one could have this kind of freedom of the will even under determinism. To see in more detail how this is so, let us consider an argument that an incompatibilist could give to deny that anyone could have freedom of will under determinism. First, the incompatibilist assumes that if determinism is true, then when we have a will, we are necessitated to have such a will. Second, if we are necessitated to have some will, then we could not have willed otherwise. Third, one has freedom of will only if one could have willed otherwise. So this is a version of the principle of alternate possibilities. From these three premises follow the conclusion. If determinism is true, then we do not have freedom of the will. Let us take a look at these premises that jointly imply that we do not have freedom of the will if determinism is true. First, most compatibilists would concede the first premise. Second, although some compatibilists have denied the second premise, Frankfurt concedes this premise as well. The premise that Frankfurt denies is premise 3, and his theory of personhood constitutes a justification for his denial. Therefore, the incompatibilist argument does not hold, and we have reason to accept compatibilism about freedom of the will. There could be a parallel incompatibilist argument about moral responsibility as well, which I leave to you as an exercise. After you have drawn the argument, try to think for yourself which premise would Frankfurt deny and why. Now let us get back to the two desiderata that Frankfurt's account of personhood wants to satisfy. First, it becomes easier to see why animals and wantons do not seem to be able to enjoy freedom of the will and have moral responsibility. This is because, since they do not have second-order volitions in the first place, there is no sense in talking about the conformity between their will and their second-order volitions. Second, it is desirable to be a person because a person, when she enjoys freedom of the will, satisfies her second-order volition, which satisfaction is something mere animals and wantons cannot enjoy. I would like to end this video with a question. Remember that Richard Taylor's objection to compatibilism is that even when our actions are in perfect accord with our desires, To say that we are morally responsible for our actions seems to require that we are morally responsible for our desires as well. And thus arises an infinite regress that is bound to get out of our deliberate control. Now, it is possible to adapt this objection to Frankfurt's current compatibilist proposal. Frankfurt thinks that we are free and morally responsible for our action when our action conforms with our will and when our will conforms with our second-order volition. But in what sense are we responsible for our second-order volitions? If determinism is true, and we could not have had a different second-order volitions than what we currently have, does it endanger of our moral responsibility? I look forward to hearing your thoughts when we take up this question in our next town hall. Thank you.